Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last in our series of stem cell transplant videos. And I'm Susan Thornton, the CEO of the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation. And today we will be joined by two stem cell transplant recipients. Joe Carey joins us from Arizona, and Jeff Ward joins us from the UK. Thank you both for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you come and chat a little bit about your experiences.
Good to be here.
Yep.
Great, great. So I thought we'd start first by giving you each an opportunity to just say a little bit about yourself, what you were diagnosed with, maybe when you were diagnosed, and so we can set the stage of where you were prior to your stem cell, and then we'll go back to kind of how you came upon the decision and what that was like for you and deciding to go the stem cell transplant route. And then we'll talk a little bit about each of your experiences and kind of where you are today and how it's been post-transplant. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All righty. So Joe, you're next to me. So I'll turn to you to share a little bit about your diagnosis with cutaneous lymphoma and a little bit about your journey that led up to transplant.
Okay. I was first diagnosed in 1995. Mycosis fungoides, stage 1A, right at the beginning. I had rashes on my skin and didn't know what they were and went through a number of dermatologists before I finally landed with one at Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona, that was able to definitively diagnose it. I went through a lot of treatments along the way and ended up in the mid-2000s, 2003-4, being advancing to Sézary syndrome, stage 4A. So I had my stem cell transplant in July of 2011. So that's just about 12 years ago. By 2009, my symptoms had worsened to the point that my quality of life was pretty bad. My meds weren't working. I was on Targretin and extracorporeal photopheresis at the time. And the efficacy of the drugs was just fading. And I was not in a happy place at all.
So they put me on the clinical trial for what was then called KY0761. It was an experimental drug, which eventually became mogolizumab, MOGA for short. And
this improved my symptoms significantly, and Dr. Kim suggested a transplant citing good disease control as a prerequisite. So we had some additional chemotherapy to resolve some large lymph nodes, and we got me on the National Marrow Donor Program database. And by the winter, spring of 2010, 2011, a fully matched donor was found, and we were on the way. We scheduled my transplant.
Great, great. Well, and that was many years ago. So I'll be very curious to see in a little bit to talk to you about your experience kind of going through it. And then we'll talk a little bit about, what the last many, many years have been like for you. So Jeff, you have had a little different experience perhaps.
Yeah, sure. My story is very similar to that of Joe in that I probably had CTCL or mycosis fungoides from about 2002. And all the misdiagnosis, and was finally diagnosed in 2007. And various treatments kept it well under control. So I had PUVA and localized radiotherapy, bexarotene, as Joe mentioned, Targretin, and also total skin electron beam radiotherapy. And then in November 2020, I went for a usual checkup, and it was found that the disease had moved to my lymph nodes, and the prognosis was not very good. I was initially given chemo and another round of total skin electron beam, And the idea was to find a stem cell transplant. They said that that was really the only treatment that would possibly work. That was back in November 2020. And fortunately, eventually 7 or 8 perfect matches were found, but a lot of them pulled out of the process. And it wasn't until October 21 that I was able to actually get the transplant. I was lucky because in the UK, they wouldn't have done it if I was over 70. And by the time I had the transplant, I was 69 and considered to be fit. So that's when I had mine. And that was now, well, 18 months ago, 19 months ago. And things have progressed since then.
Yeah. And you had the additional challenges of grappling with this through COVID as well, which I'm guessing probably added a few different twists and turns and things along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. Because once I was in hospital, going in for the treatments was a decision as to whether to get, it was better to go in and have the chemo and radiotherapy and risk COVID or not. And then similarly, once I was in hospital for the transplant, visitors were not permitted for most of the time I was in hospital.
Right. So you were pretty much on your own. Must have been challenging.
Well, we did cheat slightly in that people would look through the window, and I was fortunate that my consultant was allowing me to go out for walks at weekends. It just so happened that my wife happened to be parking the car in the car park at Hammersmith Hospital at the same time, and we meet up there.
Very nice. Very nice. So Joe, you traveled pretty far to go through this process, right? You were living still in Arizona, but you traveled up to the Bay Area to be up where Stanford. How did you kind of get there, and how did that come about? And then how long did you stay up there during the process?
Well, when I started progressing past mycosis fungoides and having the symptoms of Sézary, and I had done a lot of internet research on this disease and knew where all the centers of excellence were. Mayo Clinic is a good facility in Scottsdale, but they don't have a dedicated CTCL department, if you will. Stanford does, of course, MD Anderson does, City of Hope does, Yale, University of Pennsylvania, at least here in the United States. I'm sure there's similar places like that in Europe. But so I looked at that and saw that Dr. Kim was well regarded up in Palo Alto, and so I decided to get a consult with her. So I first saw her in 2002. She was the doctor that put me on Targretin for the first time, and so that's how I hooked up with Stanford. Getting to the transplant was a bit of a process. I was on a number of different treatments along the way, and as I said earlier, it wasn't until we determined that most of those weren't working for me, and then I got on the clinical trial for the MOGA before it was approved for general use. That put me in a situation where I was able to get fit enough, if you will, healthy enough, non-symptomatic enough to be able to entertain the transplant. So I was number 11 transplant for CTCL patients at Stanford. I think they're up in the 40s or 50s now. And I had to, you're right, I had to live in the Palo Alto area. We found an apartment in Sunnyvale, and we lived there for 5 months. We just basically had to pack up, my wife and I and the 2 dogs, and packed everything in the car and headed on up there, and we stayed there for 5 months to go through the process.
Yeah. Wow. And I think some things have changed since then. You were, I know sometimes now they're doing a little more outpatient, although that wasn't the case for Jeff either. But how long did you stay in the hospital then, or you stayed there close by?
Well, I had the non-myeloablative allogeneic transplant protocol, which I believe is pretty typical for CTCL patients. I don't think it varies a whole lot from that. I was only hospitalized, if you will, for 5 days, 6 days, I think it was, and that's when I was administered the ATG, the rabbit protein, the anti-thymocyte globulin that dumbs down your immune system. And of course, I had all the expected reactions from that. So being in the hospital was the right way to go until I was, getting a little bit back to what my new normal would be for a few months, and I was able to go back to our apartment. But early in the process, like Jeff, I had to go through the total skin electron beam radiation treatment as a preparatory regimen, total lymphoid radiation. I've thought about sending the picture where I've got the port in my chest and I've got all the markers, drawings on my chest where they set up the radiation each day when I was having that done. I thought that might have been a little bit too much information, but anyway, so I went through all that, went through the preparatory process, and then had the transplant. And I always say I made the right choices along the way, picking Stanford and their team up there. I saw early in the process, I was going up there every day. We were getting in the car every morning and driving up to Stanford. And then within about 2 weeks after transplant, that was reduced to 3 days a week, and then 2 days a week. And then eventually I was discharged and allowed to go home back to Phoenix.
Nice. But an extensive adventure, needless to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is you 1 year out, right? This picture.
This was July 29th, 2012. This was the 1 year anniversary. I don't know whether we did that by design or not, but I was doing follow-ups with the Stanford team in that first year, probably once every month or two. And so my 1 year visit was this day, the picture you see, and they got me a cake and we had a little in the clinic celebration. It was kind of fun. It was a big surprise to me. I had no idea they were going to do that.
That's nice. That's nice. Hey, got to celebrate every moment, right? That's a good thing. It's a good thing. So Jeff, you had a similar challenge. You spoke a little bit about some of the hurdles you had to get over with your donors, because you had folks lined up. You mentioned that, and then you didn't have donors. I know that was an issue, and you made you wait, right? How was that going through that? Like, you were ready, but
yeah, I mean, I think I had a similar sort of process to Joe, in that I had the chemo, and then did the TSEB, which I struggled with, and that was really the only time during the whole process that I actually struggled. It wasn't a problem, but in the UK they will only do it as an inpatient, and as you mentioned earlier, Susan, I was doing it during COVID. So what happened was that I had to visit the hospital several times. The first time was just before I went in. They put in a Hickman line. So I went in through the neck and came out through the chest. And that was great, because once it was in, it meant that I wasn't being stabbed every few minutes or few hours. And then once I was in hospital, as Joe mentioned, I had the radiotherapy 5 days a week for 2 weeks. And I also used ACG rather than chemo to remove the immune system. And that was 5 days of very long infusions. And they would only do it at one ward within one hospital in London, that was at Hammersmith. When I went in, or before I went in, I was told that in all probability, I'd get very high temperatures and fevers. I was almost certain to need blood pressure medication. I was almost certain to need blood transfusions. I'd lose my appetite and would need to be fed through a tube. And I'd probably spend a few days in the intensive care unit. And in all probability, I'd be in hospital for 7 to 11 weeks. I didn't get any of that. I was very, very lucky. One of the nurses said to me he dealt with 200, not necessarily CTCL, but 200 transplants. I was only the second one who hadn't had any of those problems. And what happened was that all my bloods were fine after about 10 days after the transplant, except for the neutrophil. And once that was boosted by an injection, I was able to go home, and I was actually only in for 30 days. And I was able to go home on my granddaughter's 7th birthday and hid in the back garden. And we said to her, look, we've got an extra present for you. And she came out and said it was the best present she'd ever had.
Oh, well, yes.
That's how mine
so wonderful.
worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's really great to see both of you here, and maybe we can switch gears a little bit because Joe, you've been now, wow, over 10 years, right?
Going on almost 12.
Almost 12. Wow, that's wonderful. So what has that time period been for you? Have you had any kinds of relapses, or what's your experience been in the last 12 years? How has that?
I feel like I've been so fortunate in this whole process. My donor was a 10 on 10 match, perfect match. The transplant took nearly 100%. I had no GVHD, nor have I had any GVHD, not a single symptom, which is very uncommon. I've had no CTCL symptoms since the transplant. Dr. Wang, the BMT doctor at Stanford, that saw me through the process and I continue to see for follow-up, declared me cured after about 3 or 4 years. I never thought I'd hear that word in this journey. My quality of life is good. My wife and I are active. We travel frequently. I saw Jeff doing the bicycles. We have bicycles. I don't ride bikes, but I'm a skier. I continue to go snow skiing. I play golf. I have what feels like a fairly normal life for almost a 74-year-old. I liken my success with my transplant. I tell people that I don't buy lottery tickets because I won't win. I already have. That was my lottery winning, was finding my donor and basically getting my life back.
I think Joe and I are very similar. We've got similar amounts of hair, it looks like, seeing him on screen. I too have had no GVHD. I was told you're certain to get some of it and maybe we'll induce it. I've had none of it at all. And it hasn't stopped me doing anything. As you mentioned, the bike ride, I did that after I'd had the 10 rounds of chemo, actually 17 days after the chemo. And although they said they thought it was stupid, my 2 specialists, Professor Whitaker, who's a dermatologist, and Stephen Morris, who's the oncologist, joined me on a 55-mile ride, which we did for raising money for their 2 research projects. And since then, I've been 100% donor, both whole blood and T cell, from about day 60. And I've got no other symptoms. I too ski, play golf. The only thing I've found is that my red blood count is actually, it's in the acceptable level, but it's quite low. So I was actually ski touring, so climbing up hills. I found that quite tough this season, but otherwise I've not been affected at all. And as you say, it's just been unbelievably successful. At one point, I wasn't sure I wanted to go through with it, because I was told that the prognosis was sort of 2 years if I hadn't gone through this, but I would have had maybe 18 months of good time. The danger was that I waited for the transplant, went through all of the processes, and if it hadn't worked, then who knows? But been fortunate like Joe, and it's worked really well, and it's not stopped me doing anything.
Yeah, I think that's so wonderful and extraordinary, and it's not something that anyone undertakes lightly. It's not an easy decision, right? Because we still don't have, not everyone is as fortunate, and we don't have necessarily enough science yet to be able to say for one person that this is going to be really successful and you'll be great, and another person that it's not going to work. The success rates, I think, are still around 40% of the transplant working in cutaneous lymphoma. And then out of those people, a percentage have graft versus host disease to varying degrees, some manageable, some not so manageable. So it's still, it's a risky endeavor. So maybe each of you can just share, and I know, Joe, we have a picture of you with your donor as well, which must have been a really amazing experience to be able to share and to thank her personally.
It certainly was. Yep. We had planned this trip to Europe. We actually were doing a cruise in the Baltic Sea. This was about 6 or 7 years after the transplant. And I had already been in communication with Romy. We, through Stanford, we first were able to I was able to send an email to someone who would then forward it to Romy, and she was able to communicate back to me the same way. So through an intermediary, we weren't allowed to have direct communication. We weren't allowed to have direct communication with each other until 2 years after the transplant. And when we were finally able to do that, we were sending pictures back and forth, and pictures of grandkids and all the good stuff. And my wife and I and my cousin and his wife planned this trip to Northern Europe, and we were going to be stopping at on the coast of Germany. And Romy lives about 2 hours south of Berlin. We were going to be about 2 hours north of Berlin. So we met in the middle, and we spent a couple hours together, and it was just wonderful. She's a wonderful lady. We talked about, she speaks some English, good enough. And, we talked about how she got on the donor database in Europe, and how that communicated with the National Marrow Donor Program in the United States, and how they cross-referenced their databases, and that's how we found each other. So yeah, it was something.
Yeah, that's so just a little shout out to anybody that might want to just put your name on the donor list, because we need people from all different backgrounds, all different shapes, sizes, and things to be bone marrow donors, so that other people coming down the pike have better chances of finding the right match. So that's, yeah, important. So anybody out there, I'll just put a little plug. If you want to help other people and you're able to and interested in becoming a donor, it's a good thing to do, because we have 2 people here that found their donors through the database.
Yeah, mine, I've written to my donor. We've written number to number through the Anthony Nolan International Register. I know it's a 21-year, or he was when he gave the cells, a 21-year-old Israeli. But other than that, we don't know each other's names, and we've written to each other. I've written to him. I haven't had a reply. But then again, I'm not sure how certain I am that it's been passed on, because I wrote one or two things in there that perhaps a bit of a giveaway, not a name or anything, but we'll wait and see a bit further down the line.
Yeah, yeah. So one question to each of you before we let you go is, if someone is watching this and they find themselves in the circumstance, right, similar to where both of you were at the time of having to make a decision, is there anything that you would like to share with someone who might be in that process of, should I go for the stem cell, should I not? Is there anything that you might that might help them make a decision that would be best for them? Or any tips or thoughts?
I don't know if I knew then what I know now. I don't think I would do much differently. I don't think it would affect my decision-making process. For me, it was presented to me as it's a good time to do it. You're in a good place. We've got the disease under relative control, and this is your best chance at kicking it to the curb, if you will. And so I was ready, willing, and able to do it. The best advice I could give someone who's entertaining a transplant, if they haven't already done so, is to definitely consult with one of those centers of excellence in their area. I mean, I don't know where the ones are in Europe, but I do know that in the US, Stanford, MD Anderson, City of Hope, Yale, University of Pennsylvania, those are the top ones that I know of. And depending on where one lived, I would certainly encourage anybody to go beyond their local doctor and seek advice, or at least a consult, a second opinion from those folks. The one thing I have read, I have determined in my research on this and speaking to doctors, I've been to a couple of meetings of national organizations, worldwide organizations on CTCL and transplantation. And the one thing I've determined is that of the CTCL variants, transplant seems to work better, seems to have a better chance of success in accessory patients versus MF patients. I don't say that with having any medical authority whatsoever. It's just what I've heard. And so that's something that somebody might want to consider as well. Yeah.
I suppose from my point of view would be, I was told that I could do the transplant because if we could find a donor, because I was relatively fit and active. And I think that's important, that if someone is going to be on that path to a transplant, try and stay as fit as possible. So I tried not to stop doing anything that I was doing while I was having the treatments, both the chemo, the radiotherapy. I really struggled, but it was only 4 weeks. But otherwise, just keeping fit and active really seemed to help. And I think that's what the doctors and nurses when I was in hospital seemed to say. I mean, I was the only one that used the little exercise bike in the hall in the ward. They thought I was nuts, but I'd go out there, and of course during COVID, they said, "Oh, take the mask off. You can't breathe in the carbon dioxide. Take the mask off while you're on the bike." And so I'd use it every morning. But it was just staying fit, and I think that really did help. As far as a decision is concerned, I think age makes a difference as well. You know, if you're very near the top end, then I think there's more of a decision to make. If you're quite young, I think you really have no choice, because if the prognosis is, as mine was, 2 years or, you know, potentially a normal life, well, you know, you've got a long way to go if you're in your 30s. As I say, mine was through MF, and then it was in the lymph node. So I don't know whether that's more successful or not. But I say, I think we've both been very lucky.
Yeah, and just this anecdotally. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say I'd agree with Jeff on the being fit part and how that helps. And one thing I recall from my recovery process after the transplant was my doctors told me, they said, don't you sit around your apartment and watch TV. Put your HEPA mask on, go outside and take walks every day, get exercise, keep the blood flowing, you know, don't be sedentary. Your best chance of getting through this recovery is to work through it and be active rather than be sedentary. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just, again, anecdotally, as I've met people that have gone through the stem cell over the years, I think you're both right. You know, being active and being as fit as you can possibly, as healthy as you can possibly be, can make a difference or can really be helpful to go through the process. So, but thank you both for sharing. It's so nice to see you both. Joe, I know it's been a long time since I haven't been down to Arizona. So thanks for joining us.
I know, it's been a long time since been a long time since I've seen you, Susan. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really great to see you. And it's nice to see that you're thriving and doing well. And between the two of you, maybe, you know, who knows, a ski trip somewhere. You know, Joe, you can show Jeff some of your haunts, and Jeff, you've got places in Europe. There you go. Well, thank you both again for joining us. It's really been a pleasure. It's lovely to see you both, and you know, wish you all well as you continue to be healthy and happy and sliding down the slopes.
Yeah.
Take good care, everybody.
Thank you for inviting me. Yep.